if I have a team that's good or a team that at least I feel like, actually has some potential there, I'm more willing to kind of take that chance on the upside stash.
Listener, if you're not aware, I'm speaking with Marcas Grant. You should be looking at the title of this episode. But Marcus, you're referring to there's now the merger between ESPN and NFL. Man, I mean, like obviously I know there's things you can't say, but what's the feeling right now? I know from a lot of people on the outside looking in, it's just like, wow, feels like Disney's everywhere now.
Disney is everywhere right now. And I say this as somebody who works part-time already for Disney. Out here in LA, I part-time work for ESPN 710 in Los Angeles. So I've already sort of, been hand in hand with the mouse for a little while. Gotta say, free Disneyland's a pretty good perk, especially when you have a 6-year-old son. It's a really good perk. As for the merger, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of mixed feelings because those of us who've been with the NFL for a while, it's been rumored for the last 4 or 5 years. I think for a lot of us, it dragged on to the point of like, we just want something to get done. Like we were tired of monitoring Andrew Marchand's Twitter feed to find out news about what was happening with our company. So now that it's happened, I think there's a sense of relief that, okay, at least the rumor part of this is done. I would admit there's definitely some uncertainty because right now it's so new. There's not a lot of concrete answers as to what's going to happen. But I think everybody at this point is just kind of ready to move forward and ready for whatever this new chapter is going to be with ESPN.
Yeah, man. I mean, I'm sure it's exciting. I'm sure there's a little bit of nerves there too. Like just like anything, like there's a bunch of differences. You said you're moving. Where are you headed to? You don't
I'm
have to give
staying
us your
in town.
exact address.
I'm staying in town. I'm not moving far from where I currently
Okay.
live, but again, school, kids, trying to find a good school district and a good school. So, moving sucks, man.
Yes, I just did it. I just did it like 4 months ago. It's a nightmare.
If you ever want to find out how much useless crap you have, pack it all up and move it somewhere else. So that is the journey my wife and I are going through right now.
Man, and moving is like I know it's like it's sometimes good because you clean out all the crap that you didn't want. For me and my wife, it ended up being a thing where we realized how different we are in terms of I wanted to throw away everything, and she was like, "Well, we're probably going to need that at some point." Just a nightmare, just an absolute nightmare.
I've lost track of how many trips to Goodwill I've made so far, and I'm going to make plenty more. We're sort of downsizing too. We're going to a little bit of a smaller house, and I'm like, I feel like this is good. We can clear out things we don't use. My wife's like, I don't know. I'm so worried about it. Like, I'm like, look, there are things we've got in like this garage that we haven't touched in 3 years. Like, if we haven't touched it in 3 years, we could probably let it go.
That's a just good general rule of life. 3 years, no use. Let's get it out of here. But man, I'm so happy that you're joining me here today. This whole project, this idea of the Pretend GM has been to connect fantasy football players with the analysts that do this for a living and try to bridge that knowledge gap, so to speak. And not that like, oh, we're so smart and we know everything, but it's just like what goes into the day-to-day of like why we think the way we do, and a peek behind the curtain that person that's just playing in their home league with their friends, you can be just as good at this and be able to look at the game the same way. And so like the first thing that I know that I always hear from people is oh man, you got to be watching every game, and you've got to be on every single waiver wire and every single this and that, and how many leagues are you in? That's so many leagues. How do you find the time? So I know with you're a husband, you're a dad, you do a bunch of other things outside of football. Like, how do you find the time for this? I know it's your job, right? So you kind of have to, but how do you find the time?
I will say that it's become a lot more challenging since I have become a husband and a father. Back before, like when I started this job at the NFL way back in 2011, I was a single dude living in a 1-bedroom apartment. And so like I would work and I'd come home from work at the office and, I'd make dinner, maybe watch an hour of TV. And then I would just start grinding stats and watching games and that sort of thing. I have sort of learned how to manage my time a little bit more, right? Obviously Sundays, Mondays, Thursdays, I'm watching games. I'm watching as much as I possibly can. What I have sort of learned now, because, I still want to spend time with I want to be married and still have a child at the end of the season.
Right?
It's really nice, you know? So what I've learned is to sort of prioritize like things to watch and things to research, right? Like where once upon a time when I, lived by myself, I probably would use, I'd use like the NFL stuff, like the I'm like, why am I calling it Game Pass? But whatever. I'd watch the condensed games.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a bad employee. I can't even remember the name of our products, but whatever. I would watch like the condensed games and go through like every single thing, every single game in a particular week. Like now, I will tend to watch the games. Like if I didn't get to see it, I will watch a game that I feel like has more broad fantasy relevance, right? Games where there are guys that are a bunch across, that people have across a bunch of their teams. So, I will try to watch every game, but I'm not necessarily going to lock in on a ton of Browns games, for instance, right? Like I'm not going to
Right,
lock in.
right.
I'm not gonna lock in at a bunch of Titans games. I will definitely make sure I catch a couple across the course of the season because you want to see how guys are performing. You definitely want to see if guys are improving or getting worse or what have you. But I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm not gonna sit here and see all 17 Titans games this year, right? So it's about prioritizing. It's about managing time. It's also just about realizing that, from August to January or February, the hours are just a little bit longer. So I work during the day. I do shows. I write columns. I do podcasts. But I do make time to come home and have dinner and do bedtime with my kids. So sometimes that means, it's after 10 o'clock, it's after 11 o'clock, and I'm still grinding things. So, you figure it out. I always tell people, especially now, this will be season 15 for me at the NFL.
Wow. Congrats, man.
Thanks. I am sort of like that NFL veteran who I know how to get my body in shape for training camp, right? Like I'm not going to be like that, young rookie or second year guy who's just grinding like crazy and hitting the weight room and doing like all this off-season training. Like I know enough to get myself in shape for when the preseason starts and week one comes around. I think I've just figured that out after all these years.
But I think the thing you were referencing was that NFL Pro.
NFL Pro
has
that's definitely a good thing for sure. But yeah, I mean,
no
I guess
free
NFL
ads,
Plus
by
has
the way.
stuff.
But we'll do that for you.
That's fine. I appreciate it. NFL Plus. It's you guys know what I'm talking about. You can watch all the games.
Yeah.
It's like Red Zone. It's got stuff, game replays, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's something that I've tried to use because you can't watch every single game all at the same time. You're watching Red Zone and you'll get the highlights, but you can't watch every single thing. And then all of a sudden a guy pops off for 30 points and you've never heard of him. You're like, well, I got to go watch that now and figure that out. So that could be a good resource for the people watching or listening.
Sure.
But you know what I think is always fun to do is try to see where we kind of connect with the people that are consuming our content, because there's always a time where I'll ask everyone, what's something from your background that people wouldn't expect, but ends up being something that totally shapes how you approach fantasy football. Like what's maybe a skill set you have or an experience that you had that changes the way you look at this game. And then there's always someone that goes, oh, same thing here. I'm just like that. And they relate to you so easy. What's that one thing for you?
I think it's being a guy who, I wasn't, before I started this job, I wasn't like some football diehard, some football junkie. I watched the NFL. I enjoyed it. I grew up in Northern California as a 49er fan. I grew up in the heyday of Joe Montana, Steve Young, Jerry Rice. It was a good time to be a 49er fan at that point. But I was never a football junkie. So even now, as I come to this job and I do this, I'm not a tape grinder, right? I'm not out here doing X's and O's, right? Matt Harmon is one of my good friends, right? That dude grinds tape. He's watching wide receivers.
He is a tape.
He really is. He really is. I'm not a spreadsheet warrior, right? I'm not one of those guys who's building algorithms. I feel like what I want to do is sort of connect with everybody who else is like that, right? Because most people who play fantasy don't have that kind of time. I try to come to this from the aspect of I want to learn all these things, right? I read all the people who do these things and I follow them. I watch them. I try to learn from them every day. And I feel like my job is to kind of distill all of that and explain it to people who are just sort of, from the diehards to the casuals, right? I think part of what I've learned working at the NFL is that we have a wide user base, right? So we've got the hardcore folks, who are looking at next gen stats and grinding that kind of stuff. But we have a lot of people who just play like in an office league or a home league, and they just don't want to look like, jerks. In their respective leagues. I mean, like my wife played for a number of years, right? And so I'm like, how do I explain this to her? Because, she doesn't care about yards per route run. But like, how can I explain to her why she should draft Jacoby Myers in the late rounds or something? I'm just pulling names out of the thin air right now. But, it's so I think that is sort of my lane that I've tried to stay in, is just being that guy who can explain things to everybody and sort of, incorporate everybody in. And I think some of it is just, I spent years in radio before I got here, and just being able to talk to a wide audience about a variety of subjects, I think has sort of, helped me kind of stay in this lane where I don't necessarily live in one world or the other, but try to marry them as best as possible.
Man, I love that you said that you did radio. I got to do radio for a little bit. I started out as an intern, then producer, and then I got to take a little thing on the side. But it truly makes you have to like rethink how you say things. It's almost like being a teacher, right? Like just because you have it one way in your head doesn't mean you can get it out to people. And it's like, it's so important to be relatable. And with this, we are taking game, like you said, there's spreadsheets and data, and there's people who know what they're watching when they're watching the games. And like, if you can't make it relatable, it almost doesn't matter. You're not a very good analyst if you can't make the information comprehensible to the people that are trying to get this from you. So let's do this to make this as simple as possible for someone that's watching or listening. If you had not that we can ever break it down to just one thing, but if you had one general rule of thumb from Marcas Grant on fantasy football, something I'd put on the thumbnail with your face and look all fancy, what would that rule be?
Draft good players.
That's a pretty good one. I'm not gonna lie.
Draft good players. I think the simplest thing is draft players. And I mean, it's gonna sound simplistic, and it's gonna be kind of an offshoot of that. But draft players on teams that score a lot of points, right? I mean, like, I think that's kind of what it comes down to. And like, we break it down into different stats and metrics and all these sorts of things. But essentially what it is the players that tend to help you win in fantasy, they are usually coming from offenses that score a lot of points. They move up and down the field. They pick up a lot of yards, because in its essence, the game is simple. You want guys that catch the football or run the football, that pick up a lot of yards, and that find the end zone. That's really what it is. And everything else that we use to analyze basically just gets you to that end game. I know that for people who don't necessarily play fantasy or who care for fantasy, there's a lot of people out there who watch football who don't care for fantasy. That's fine, whatever. I always try to explain to them that what we do, that our podcast, our TV shows, whatever, we're just a football show. And we're just talking about football the way a lot of other people talk about football. The difference with our stuff is that at the end of all of our analysis, we basically say, and that's why you should start him this week. Yeah. Like, that's pretty much what it is. So for all of the highfalutin numbers that we put out there, it basically just comes down to, hey man, the Bengals are probably going to score a lot of points this year. Like, you should try and draft as many Bengals as you can.
Yeah, honestly, I'm such a big believer in vibes still matter in the NFL. Like, as much as we love data and film and all these other things that are tangible, right? And I think that's what a lot of people get stuck on, is you need the tangibility of it. But this is still a game with people and emotions and things that are out of our control, and so the intangibles really matter. So, like saying this is a good player on a good team, the vibes are great over there. Like, that's actually a real thing, right? Like I will see. This is going to release mid-season, so it could end up being totally wrong. But like, a lot of people have been worried about the vibes of the Miami Dolphins, the team that I root for, and it's just like, okay, mid-season, let's find out where we're at. It's good players on a good offense, but we just don't know. And when I think of that, I think back to like when I first started playing fantasy football, where it was as simple as get good players on good teams and good situations that they're going to score. Like, I remember saying, man, Calvin Johnson, he's going to catch a bunch of touchdowns. He's got a good quarterback and he's an incredibly talented player. I'm going with him in round 1. And then round 2 on the way back, I really like that Marshawn Lynch fella. He's probably going to score a lot of touchdowns. And it was so simple, but I'd find myself winning leagues. So if you could rewind back to when Marcas Grant first started playing fantasy football, what has changed in the way that you view the game from then to now?
Well, it's very simple, first of all, because I'll tell you, like, my first fantasy experience, I was a freshman in college way back in the late 1900s.
You called it the late 1900s.
The late 1900s is when I first started playing fantasy. I actually shared a team with my roommate. I was working at the student radio station. Like, it was the commissioner was one of the seniors on the staff, and he needed had a couple spaces open, so me and a roommate shared the last space. And with my very first draft pick in fantasy football, and you're a Dolphins fan, was Dan Marino. Right, which nowadays, if you're like, I spent my first pick on a quarterback, you get laughed out of the room. But like back then, like, we hadn't evolved draft strategy to that point, right? And so, like, we looked at it as, hey man, Dan Marino throws a lot of touchdowns. He throws for a lot of yards. He's gonna score a lot of points, and like, it just made sense. People drafted quarterbacks in the first round. Like, that was wasn't a big deal. Like, obviously now, all these years later, like, you would warn everybody against that. In fact, if you heard people who were saying that, you're like, can I be in your league? Because I want to, I want to draft against you. So I think that part of it, like, we have obviously evolved strategy and stuff a long way. I think the biggest part of it, I think part of how that's evolved is the democratization of fantasy football. And the internet has gone a long way toward that, because also part of my experience when I first played, I'm gonna let you know right now, I'm gonna use a whole lot of old timey words when I talk about my fantasy football experience.
Oh boy!
When we set our lineups, we had to use a telephone and call our commissioner's answering machine and tell him. So this is, hey, we want to start this guy at quarterback and this guy at running back and wide receiver and blah, blah, blah.
Would you send a fax?
So he would send a fax with the stats, like, at the end of the week.
Yes.
Like, if we woke up on Sunday morning and you found out, that one of your guys that was a scratch for whatever reason, like, you'd have to get back on the phone before kickoff and be like, hey, we need you to take this guy out of the lineup, put this guy back in the lineup. The other part of that is, you didn't know who your opponent started. You could sort of look at their roster and maybe, maybe guess. You kind of like look at the roster and be like, okay, they're probably starting this guy, that guy, whatever. But you didn't know for sure. And then for us, part of it was that because our commissioner lived off campus, he might not get us the stats right away. It might be Wednesday or Thursday sometimes before we got stats. It was like whenever he was on campus and available to kind of drop them off. Right. It sometimes felt like a drug deal. Like, he would pull up to the front of my dorm and, like, would call my room and be like, hey, I got the stats. And, like, I would run outside and he'd roll down the window of his car and he'd hand me a packet and I'd run back inside and then we would like dig over them. But, like, a lot of times I would get the LA Times on a Monday morning or a Tuesday morning, and we'd go through the box score and we would try to kind of hand calculate what our score totals were for the week, So, like, you really had to want it to play fantasy football back then. So nowadays, like, if I get a tweet from somebody because, like, the app glitched and, like, they've had to wait 7 minutes for their Saquon Barkley touchdown, I'm like, hey, man.
No sympathy there.
I'm like, relax, bro. Like, you're going to be fine. It's going to be okay. But I think because the internet made it so much more accessible, obviously it brought a lot more people in, and it brought a lot more people who think about the game and are trying to basically solve for X within the game. So, the internet's gone a long way toward changing literally everything we know about, what essentially started off as Dungeons and Dragons for sports nerds.
I've never heard anyone call it Dungeons and Dragons for sports nerds, and I love it so much. Just D&D for football. I love what you said about it being accessible, because that's the first thing I started to think of, is just like going back to how you said, like, it was something that if you were playing, it's because you loved it, because you had to take so many steps each week and you were just really grinding it out. But now it's become so accessible, not in a bad way, like in a good way. There's so many people playing it. I don't think there's as many jobs in this market if it's not as accessible as it is.
No.
Like, we're probably not doing this. There's probably like 6 people doing it in the entire world. But like, with that, I think also just becomes I would say a greater spectrum of error with more players. Obviously, there's more different ways that people play and more common mistakes and like more beginners just starting out. So, what would you say to someone who's just starting out? Because I mean, we see a lot of these common mistakes that happen, and then someone will jump into fantasy football and make like 6 of those common mistakes in their very
Right.
first season and be like, okay, well, don't do that again. Got it. So, what are the most common mistakes you see happening?
I mean, honestly, I think, it is still, people still draft quarterbacks probably too early. I think, I mean, I always say this, especially for analysts, for people like us who do this for a living. I always remind them, like, jump in a home league or jump in a league with folks who are a little more casual and like see how they draft. We're so used to doing these expert drafts where, it's almost like a game of chicken to see who's going to take the first quarterback a lot of times.
Dude, I'm telling you, we just did an episode where we were talking about ADP, and I referenced that Drake May's ADP is in the 10th or 11th round. And then I looked at an industry league draft I did this last week where he went in round 14. It's like you're 100% right. It's just playing chicken. It's not even close to what the average consumer is doing.
Right, exactly. So you play in a league just full of just, like a regular office, an office league that doesn't, center around football or something like that. And like, there might be 4 quarterbacks gone by the end of the second round, depending on like how the league sets up. So, I mean, that's definitely a mistake people make. I think people will make the mistake of drafting, trying to fill out all their starting roster spots like at the beginning, right? Feeling like, okay, I got my running backs and I got my wide receivers, quarterback. Like, you'll see people who are like, okay, well, I got to fill out my kicker and my defense spot, right? And so it's like, the 9th or 10th round and somebody's taking a kicker, right? Somebody's taking, whatever, a defense, right? Like, oh yeah, I got to get my defense, so I'm going to take the Eagles defense here in round 10. Like, you don't have to do that, but I think that's sort of how people operate. Then I'll fill in my bench spots afterwards. That's how it works, right? So I think it's stuff like that. But while, you try to warn people against stuff like that, what I always tell people, especially who are doing it the first time, is you're going to make mistakes. I mean, we've done this for years, and every now and then we still make draft mistakes, right? There are things that we do like in the moment, right? You pick a player in the moment, you're like, ugh, why did I do that? Like we still do that. So I tell people, don't be afraid to make mistakes, first of all, but make it an experience that's going to be enjoyable, right? And sometimes that means drafting players you like, or avoiding players from teams you don't like. I going back to my first ever fantasy league, right? I was one of the people in our league was the girlfriend of the commissioner, and she was from the Boston area, and she really didn't know anybody outside of Patriots players. And so she drafted, this at the time too when the Patriots were mid at best. Like, this was before Tom Brady. They were mid.
It's like the Ben Coates era.
Right. And so she drafted Drew Bledsoe and Ben Coates. I can't remember who their running back was. And like at the time, we just sort of laughed. We're like, the Patriots are not even that good or whatever, right? But Bledsoe and Coates were awesome. And she steamed, like, I know my team didn't make the playoffs. She steamrolled us. I'm friends with her now. To this day, 30 years later, I'm friends with her, and she still every now and then like lets me know about it. That like the time she steamrolled the NFL's fantasy guy in our league.
That's so
like, yeah, but I tell people, like, have fun with it. Make it an enjoyable experience because, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to do things that you kick yourself about. But at least if you had fun, if you have players that you enjoy watching, if you had an experience that's memorable, you're more likely to come back the next year and you'll learn more and you'll try to correct those mistakes. If you make mistakes and on top of it, you're like, this is miserable. I'm a Eagles fan and now I drafted CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott and I got to force myself to watch the Cowboys. Like, as they say in South Park, you're going to have a bad time. Like, just make it so you don't have a bad time because then you're more likely to learn more, come back, and continue to improve.
Man, I think that one of the things you said in there about like the starting lineup rings so true because I think the social media of it all makes it something that we just want to share where you draft the team and someone goes, hey, what do you think of my roster? What do you think of my lineup here? And they rarely ever send like the entire board. What they'll do is they'll just send like, here's my starting lineup. What do you think, man? I was like, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, you know what I've learned, and you probably know this. I've learned with some of those people, like you can tell the people who just want validation for their rosters. And so like, I will, like, I'll try to like give a little bit of like, hey man, your running backs, yeah, but like I love your wide receivers. I think your quarterback's
Right.
going to be great, because a lot of people, that's all they just want validation, right? Like they just want somebody to tell them that they did a good job. And so you start to learn to kind of figure out who those people are. And while you try to offer a little bit of constructive criticism, I think for the most part people just, they just want to feel good about their chances going. Like everybody's got hope in September. You just got to want to offer people that hope that they've got in September.
Yeah, honestly, like that's where I think the fandom of NFL and fantasy football intersect the most, because it's all just hope. Like there's just a lot of excitement and everyone becomes a little kid for the moment. Because drafting a team is easy. Like just sit there and pick players. But then it's like the week in, week out of like, okay, I gotta scour the waiver wire. I gotta figure out who to start. Now I gotta go make a trade. Like that's where you start to see like who's like actually really playing it for real and putting the time and effort and stuff. And so once we get past that draft and you're just looking at your team, how do you prioritize maybe keeping an upside stash on your roster versus saying like, I really need a player who can get me X amount of points each week? I hear that all the time. Who's the guy that's just going to get me like 10 points every single week versus, this guy's got a lot of contingent upside. If I just keep him on my bench, this could really pay off for me later on.
I mean, I'll be honest with you. A lot of it depends on how the team itself is doing, right? You can tell a few weeks into the season, generally speaking, how good your roster is, and even I've even had teams that maybe have started bad, but it's like I look at the roster and I'm like, okay, well, these guys are playing well, or there's something just slightly off. Like I believe this team is going to turn around. If I have a team that's good, or a team that at least I feel like, actually has some potential there, I'm more willing to kind of take that chance on the upside stash, right? Like believing that my starters are going to figure some things out, and that maybe late in the season, if I can make that playoff run, this rookie or this guy who's currently an RB2 that might take over the gig, like maybe that's the guy to put me over the hump and get me into the postseason. If I look at a team and they're on the struggle bus immediately, or I lose a guy and I know he's going to be out for 6 weeks and I'm just trying to plug holes, that's when you're going for the floor play, right? I need this. I need a Jalen Warren. Maybe I try to trade for Jalen Warren. Like I joke, Jalen Warren lives in a tiny house, right? Because the floor is kind of steady and it's fairly high, but the ceiling is also, it's pretty low, right? It's a tiny house that he lives in. But if I just need that week-to-week production, right? If I need that weekly 10 to 12 points, he might be the guy to keep my sort of bad team afloat until maybe I can swing a bigger trade or one of my injured guys comes back. So it really is sort of dependent on, how I evaluate the roster after the first month or so.
Jalen Warren, noted architectural enthusiast here. This very special house. It's like that takes me into sort of the next thing here is I know that a lot of us, like, we'll look at the app that we're on, right? Like wherever we're playing. And then the first thing that we'll see is these are the projected points you have. You're projected to lose by 30 this week. And then that'll often, sway how you're deciding your starting lineup, or it'll be a very even matchup. And then I'll often hear like, well, I don't want to take a lot of risks. So how do you balance that? What's the approach there when you see the projections? Do you follow that, or do you sort of more so go with your gut on picking players that you like, matchups and things like that?
I use it as a guideline. I don't consider it gospel, because obviously across apps too, projections are going to be different and that sort of thing. And obviously it depends on formats, a lot of things. So I'll use it sort of as a guideline. But, if I'm looking at two guys and their projections are fairly similar and I'm trying to decide between one or the other, I think that's when I sort of have to lean on my gut, right? Maybe it's the matchup. Maybe it's just, hey man, this team is just playing really, really well right now or something. And sometimes that means I'll pick the guy who has a lower projection just because there's something about the matchup or the player that I see that gives me a little bit more confidence or something like that. I mean, I think of it like, say Google Maps or Apple Maps, right? Where like you plug in your destination and it gives you a route and you look at that and you're like, there's no way I'm doing that. You look like, hey man, it's 4 o'clock on a Friday. Like, there's no way I'm driving near LAX. Like, you must be out of your mind, right? And so like Google Maps might tell me that's the fastest route, but like, I live here. I know that that's not the best way to go.
I just referenced GPS in the last episode I did with Bob Harris, where I'm like, I feel like it's the GPS where it's like my mom will tell me make 4 rights. It's next to the old McDonald's. Go there. Like, she knows where she's going. Like, without GPS, like, I'm lost. And I feel like that's how fantasy managers get. Like, without the projections, sometimes they get too lost.
Yeah. And so sometimes, like I said, I'll use the projections sort of as a guideline and try to figure some things out. But definitely, I think there's a moment where, and it helps because you and I studied this stuff and we are reading about it and watching stuff all week long. There are times where it's just like, no, this doesn't feel right. I'm going to go with my gut. Now, look, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it really doesn't. Sometimes you're just like, oh, yeah, the projection had it right. I probably should have done that. But, like, it's at least worth doing that, right? Because part of that's the fun of this, right? Is that we get to make our own decisions and we get to play the game. If we just let the algorithm handle it all the time, then like, what are we even doing here?
Thank you for saying that, man. Because like, that's what I feel like we're constantly doing, is searching for this skeleton key, the thing that's gonna solve fantasy football, the thing that fixes it for us every week that we don't have to try. And it's just like, that's not the game. Like, that's not what we're right. Like, if not, just play best ball. That's what that's for.
Right. Which, by the way, side note to that is why I am in the, I realize it's a shrinking minority or growing minority, whatever. I still like kickers.
Okay.
Because
Jake Seeley will have words with you.
Look, Jake and I have had it out about this a couple of times, right? Like, he knows where I stand on this. Because I always feel like the argument against kickers basically boils down to we can't predict them. And I'm like, good. Because I think there's an element of randomness that you sort of want. Because even in football, for as much as we have analytics and metrics and stuff, there's still an element of luck, right? I mean, you can do all the analytics you want. That doesn't tell you that Eli Manning's going to throw up a prayer and some guy's going to pin it to the top of his helmet and like help him win a Super Bowl. Right. I think there's an element of luck that comes with kickers that in some ways levels the playing field a little bit, that allows maybe a more casual player to compete with somebody who is deep in the woods on this whole thing. So yeah, I like the idea that we can't necessarily predict everything, and so like I want to keep kickers. Like, it makes me a little bit sad that people are like, we should get rid of tight ends. I'm like, I get it. There's only like 5 of them that maybe are worth anything, but like it adds an element of randomness and difficulty that I think sort of helps level everything out. Like, if it's just quarterbacks, wide receivers, and running backs, like, we've figured out pretty much how to analyze those guys. I think it makes it less fun.
The Pretend GM has now created a rivalry between Marcas Grant and Jake Seeley, because Jake also just removed tight ends from the flex league, and now it's just a tight end / wide receiver flex that everyone chose as wide receivers. So yeah, I'm sorry for this new rivalry.
Well, I say that, by the way, I say that as somebody whose Scott Fishbowl team has a grand total of 1 running back, like, because it's basically just nothing but flex positions, right?
Yeah.
And like, especially if you play, you're playing on a certain app, you get more points for receptions, you get tight end premiums or whatever. So like, I did that, and I drafted basically 3 quarterbacks, a whole bunch of wide receivers and tight ends. I think I drafted like 1 running back really late. I think it was like, I wasn't even
Jalen Warren.
No, it wasn't Jalen Warren. Like, I thought I was going to draft him. I think somebody took him like 2 or 3 slots before I had a chance to. But yeah, that's it. So while I sit here and I poo-poo Jake's idea, I sort of tried to game the system in the Scott Fishbowl too.
Well, I mean, like, that's important too, is to obviously understand the league that you're in, the settings that you have, all that. And I think the thing that like really separates people throughout the fantasy season ends up like how they approach waivers. And I've seen all different kinds of opinions on how to focus on waivers. Either, get it early because that's when you're going to get the most value out of these players. They end up having a full season role. It's like a free space in your draft board, versus I've heard hold on to all of your fab or your waiver priority for that time you really need it later on in the season, because that's, you're going to wish you had it. Yeah. So what's your framework for deciding, like, okay, I need to go all in on this player, or I need to cut bait on a player that I maybe drafted a little bit higher and they're just underperforming? What's that thought process like for you when it comes to the waiver wire?
I feel like getting, and not blowing all your fab necessarily, but I do think if you're going to find that waiver wire hero, the guy that we're always talking about at the end of the season, you are much more likely to find that guy within the first 3 weeks of the season, right? Yeah. Because usually it's, maybe it's an injury, maybe it's just a rookie that somehow steals a job and comes out of nowhere. But that guy usually reveals himself fairly early in the year. So I am not opposed to spending a good chunk of fab on that guy. I still will try to hold some back until later because, inevitably there are things that you just can't prepare for. There are mid to late season injuries, that sort of thing that you just have to be aware of. So it's always nice to kind of hold some back. I will also admit that I am sort of bad at estimating what everybody else in my league is going to bid on a player. Right. Because you also never really know how much somebody values a player or somebody else is just going to, go hard on the waiver wire early. So it's like, I always feel like I either severely underbid on a guy or severely overbid, right? Where it's like, I'll put, 70 fab dollars on a guy. And like, I think the next closest bid is like 30. I'm like, oh, wow, I really overshot that one,
Right.
So like that's a hard thing, but I think it makes sense to kind of fill in the waiver wire slots and to play it all year long. But if you want that guy that's going to be the man, I should have jumped on him, like that's going to happen probably before the end of September.
So with this, I know with waivers, a big thing is, we want to know if that player's producing, they have the opportunity, but I think also we tend to look ahead, like what's that schedule going to be like for them going forward? What's the schedule like for my current players on my roster? Do you find it advantageous to be looking further ahead in the schedule? And if so, how far do you look ahead in advance?
I think it's only worth looking maybe 2 or 3 weeks in advance. Okay. And I know for the sake of the content machine, which is always in motion, we will always do strength of schedule stuff. People will look ahead and do playoff schedule stuff. Like, look, I've done it. I'm sure when we start, when fantasy, when the podcast is up, when Fantasy Live is going on, we'll do all of the, playoff schedule sort of thing. But this, how many times do we look at the start of the season? We're like, man, this team's got a really good playoff schedule. And then by the time you get to midseason, you're like, wow, this schedule's rough. This is not going to be great at all. Just because, one, obviously teams change drastically from year to year, and they change over the course of the season, right? I mean, remember once upon a time when the Miami Dolphins hung 70 points on the Denver Broncos? And everybody was like, oh, man, like, target the Broncos, right? Like, target all your guys. But then by the end of the year, that Bronco defense had gotten to be pretty good. So, like, a team that we thought was going to be kind of a doormat in the fantasy playoffs turned out to be a team that's like, I don't know if I want to be messing with, Pat Surtain the second in the fantasy playoffs sort of thing. So, I think it's worth looking at. But I would try to limit my focus to to not more than 2 or 3 weeks in advance, because it feels like, that's when teams should. Like, if you're bad for 2 or 3 weeks, and your coaching staff isn't immediately looking at, like, okay, so what do we need to do? Like, how are we switching things up? I can show you a coaching staff that's probably going to get fired by the end of the year. So it's probably better just to keep your focus kind of narrow.
I like that you said, looking maybe 3 weeks in advance. I do think that this game, obviously it's played week to week, but I really do feel like it's played in pockets. Like I view this almost like how a fan of the NBA would view a game, where like the games are kind of, it's a game of runs. Like it streaks back and forth of, okay, now this team scored 10 points in a row. And that's sort of how it ends up being in the NFL, where I think too, like if we're going to use the schedule in reverse and go like back to look at stuff, we always hear, well, this team is allowing the most points to running backs or something like that. And then you'll look and be like, but for the last 3 weeks, they've been really, really good against running backs. So, like, is that something you try to make sure like you're giving that context as well? Like, I know, just a shameless plug here for football guys is I'll use the fantasy points against tool that we have there and just look back at recent weeks as opposed to the entirety of the season, because there's always going to be like injuries and things that change and scheme change, things like that. Is that something that you try to add that context to as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's, like you take in the number as a whole and you try to figure out where teams are. But then, I do make it a point to go back over the space of a few weeks, right? Because, maybe a team looks like they're bad against wide receivers or something like that, right? Like even over the space of a month, like the last 4 games, they've got a really bad number against wide receivers. But then you break it down and like, Jamar Chase in one of those games went for 2 bills and 3 touchdowns.
Right.
Like, so like that's going to skew that number really dramatically. So I think it is important to kind of have that context. Like it is a lot easier when you look at a defense and like every single week they're giving up a couple touchdowns to wide receivers and you're just like, oh, that's just a bad secondary. But, sometimes it's like, hey, this isn't a terrible defense. They just had they had one bad week or they just played a guy who was really, really good and that dude took advantage of them. And so I think, it's important to sort of point that out. Like you talk about vibes though. I'll let you in on maybe one of my biggest, swings and misses ever. So, you remember, the amazing Nick Foles was a 27 touchdown, 2 interception season that he had. Yes. He threw what 7 touchdown passes I think in a week or 6 touchdown passes in a week.
Something crazy.
The very next week, the Eagles were playing the Raiders, and I went on national cable television and said the Raiders are my sleeper defense of the week because there's no way Nick Foles could throw 6 touchdown passes again this week. Guess who threw 6 touchdown passes again that week? It was Nick Foles. Yeah, that was kind of a big oops. But yeah, context is always important for these things.
Context has been kind of the like hidden theme across every episode that I've had here, where it's like in one way or another it's gotten brought up by each guest and just like in the way that they use things. And I think what also like happens, whether it's people in the industry or even just fantasy managers that are playing, we sometimes see that certain concepts get misused or data gets taken out of context and misused. And even just like the example we gave here, where it's like X team is first against running backs. And it's like, well, have they really been lately? Or was that, 3 easy weeks at the beginning of the year? So what do you normally see as the concept or like data point or just that philosophy, the thing that gets misused or misunderstood the most in fantasy football?
I think home road splits are one.
Okay, I like that one. That's the first one I've heard of that.
I think home road splits and like I think for some people they are actually sort of concrete data, right? Like I think about Jared Goff and they talk about his home road splits, right? Like my friend and colleague Adam Rank very famously dubbed Jared Goff as being an indoor cat. Because like when he's inside,
right.
in Ford Field, Jared Goff is a very different quarterback than he is when he's on the road, especially when he's outdoors. Like I mean, I'm old enough to remember when he had his pro day at Cal, right? And everybody was like, Jared Goff can't throw a wet football or whatever. And just by happenstance, it happened to rain in Berkeley on the day of Jared Goff's pro day, and like he ended up having a pretty good pro day, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's all over. It's not a big deal." But like,
he can do it.
He can do it. Like, but now we've seen throughout his career that like Jared Goff outdoors in the elements is a very different quarterback than Jared Goff like indoors, under a dome in like 72-degree conditions. But I think for a lot of guys, I don't think it's necessarily the home road splits. I think it's more sometimes the teams they are playing at home versus the teams they are playing on the road, right? And I think again, if today's secret word is context, the context is sort of looking at who those opponents are. And maybe if you start to separate the signal from the noise, maybe you will see that certain guys really are better at their home stadiums. But I think what we're really talking about when we talk about home road splits is just that, like, hey, man, this team had a really tough road schedule and maybe an easier home schedule or vice versa. And I think sometimes, it's easy to just, peg it all in one thing where, sometimes it's just harder to kind of break it out and figure out, like, no, what really is going on here with that?
Man, it's funny because I think the toughest thing for us to sort of pin down, because we just don't know the information, always ends up being injuries. Like that's the thing that gets really tough. And that's why I also like I kind of just remind myself like there is an intangibility to fantasy football and just watching it in general. But we do get this all the time where we'll hear, well, we're going to see how player X is on game day, before the game. He's going to go out in warm-ups for see how he's doing, and we'll probably have him on a snap count, right? Like, that can be super frustrating as a fantasy manager. But how do you factor that into your start-sit decisions? Because I know, like, once the season kicks off and we get that first injury, we are going to get that question 10 times a week, every single week until the season is over. So how do you factor that in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, following practice reports throughout the week is a big thing. We always say, like, if a guy misses practice, Monday, Tuesday, even Wednesday, like, it's not a big deal. If he's not out there on Thursday, red flag goes up. If he's not out there on Friday, then it's time to really start thinking about making some other decisions. I mean, I feel like the worst words in the fantasy lexicon are game time decision, because then it really is like, at some point you just kind of, put it up to the football gods and kind of see how it is. I think at that point you're just sort of, how good is this player? How integral is this player to their offense and my fantasy roster? And then you sort of decide based on that. I think the other thing to keep in mind is the reason there are injury reports are basically because of folks like us, right? It's because of fantasy players. It's because of gamblers. Like, there's no sane strain of the multiverse where a coach would willingly tell you that their players are injured and what body part is hurt,
Right.
and where, like, it just doesn't ever make sense.
And how they're exactly going to deploy that player.
Right. Like, there's no strain of the multiverse where that actually makes sense to do, but it exists, especially in the NFL, because it is beneficial to a lot of the folks who consume the sport and play those peripheral games that help keep the sport going. In fact, if you want an example of that, look no further than the injury reports, right? Like, one of my early jobs at the NFL was on Sunday morning having to go in the website and list the inactives, right? The inactive players for each team. Everybody has the 8 inactive players that they have to list, but also what we have to do is go list all the guys who were like questionable or doubtful, right? Even if they're playing, just put put so-and-so, ankle, questionable, he's playing, whatever. And no team was more petty about it, and this is not going to surprise you, than the Bill Belichick Patriots, right?
Sounds
Belichick would put every single minor injury, so-and-so, stubbed toe, questionable, so-and-so, bruised ego, doubtful. I'm like, it's basically like somebody,
that laptop without his blue light glasses.
Right, exactly.
They missed the week.
It really is. It was like somebody told Bill, it's like, hey, the league says you got to list all injuries. He's like, all right, well, I'll show you. So like, obviously we're always monitoring this because we want to make sure we get the best possible lineup in there. I think there's an element of like, you watch practice reports, you see how guys are working through the week, but also just an element of sometimes coaches are lying liars who lie, and because it's not in their best interest to tell you that their starting quarterback has a bum knee and maybe can't move around all that well.
Yeah, man, it's that I think becomes the most frustrating thing in fantasy, and there's so much that ends up being out of our control, whether it's injuries or like sometimes just game plan stuff like we don't know about. Like, players will always have an off week because a coach decided to deploy them in a totally different way.
Arthur Smith.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I just brought up like so much PTSD. But I know like the best way that we can try to counteract that always ends up being waivers, or like one of my favorite things to do, 'cause it's just exhilarating, is trades. Like, just find someone in your league that you can trade with. But it also becomes one of the most frustrating things to do because everyone views a trade differently. And I gotta be honest, man, everyone feels like they're the smartest person in the room in a trade. And like, I'm just not about that life. Like, I just want this to be really simple. And I want it to be like, hey, you need this, I need that. Let's do that. I'm not trying to get one up on that person. How do you go about like even just pursuing a trade, looking for that team, looking for the player, sending the offer, all that stuff?
I mean, it really is for me about trying to find a deal that is mutually beneficial, right? If I need wide receiver help, but I've got a surplus of running backs, I'm gonna find a team that has a ton of wide receivers and maybe needs help. I want everybody to sort of win in this deal. And I think part of the problem is everybody feels like they've got to win the trade, right? They've got to feel like they got over on everybody else.
Post a picture and like send it to their friend or post it on socials.
Right. And I always tell people, like, the best trades really are mutually beneficial, at least on paper, mutually beneficial. Like, you never know what's going to happen. Like, you make a trade, a guy gets hurt, like that's sort of out of your hands. You can't do anything about that. But at least if everybody comes away from the deal feeling like they got something to help their team, I think that's really the best. I think what's made it, one, because everybody wants to win the trade, that makes it hard. The other part, I think, is for somebody who's in the industry and who does this. One, there's a tax, right? Like I'm pretty sure, like in my home league, guys that I've known, most of them since high school, because I do this for a living.
Yes.
If I'm inquiring about a player, it becomes, what does Marcus know about this guy?
Right.
Like, he must know something. So now, I'm more likely to either hold on to him or I'm going to ask for a whole lot more in return, because obviously something's up. Something that I haven't checked on is going on. So there's kind of that tax to pay for this. And then the point that you mentioned, just, you never know how people value a certain player. Some people they have more of an affinity for certain players than you realize. And that forces you to sort of, to pay more necessarily. So I will say that of all the questions, the types of questions that I get across the season, trade ones are sort of the hardest, right? Because you don't know all those other factors. The other part is, this, when people send you a trade offer that's out there, you also don't really get to see the rest of their roster. You just see the handful of players involved in a deal.
Right.
And it's like, I don't know.
Did I win?
Did you win? Like, I don't know. Sure. Like, I have no idea what you have on the rest of your roster. Maybe this is good, or maybe now you've got 3 tight ends and you just don't know what to do with any of them. Like, I have no idea.
I think the thing with like these trades is that people always want to know if they won or if they got the betterment of the deal, and it's always just like, maybe this week, dude, I don't know. But like in 3 weeks, it's not the same. Like, any one of those players can get injured, anything can happen, and it's not the same deal as before. Like, no matter what, even if you feel like you got the better side of the offer, it's always still a risk.
Still a risk. I always love the people who send me a trade. They're like, it's already been completed, right? And they're like, did I do good? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. It's done.
It feels like your kid coming home with like their arts and craft project. Like,
yeah.
Did I do good?
Did I do good? And I'm like, I mean, look, at this point, it's like no take back. So it doesn't even matter if it was a good trade or not. Like, it's done now. Like, these guys are on your team. So that's sort of it. One funny thing, I'll tell you this. There are these guys that on Twitter, I assume they were brothers, right? They had the same last name. They were about the same age. And they would both always like separately DM me, like, start sit questions or whatever. And one week, obviously one proposed the trade to the other because they both sent me the same trade offer separately on DMs. Like, should I take this? And like, the guy's like, is this a good offer? And I'm like, I feel like this is a brotherly thing, and I probably shouldn't get in the middle of this. Like, if you guys are doing separate start-sit questions, I'm down to answer that. Like, I don't think I want to get in the middle of this family squabble over fantasy football, so I think I just left those DMs. I think I left them on red that week.
So the thing that's going to happen naturally with us as well is, like, as much as we try to help people, we are undoubtedly going to be wrong. Like, it just happens. We are humans, and it happens. But when you are wrong about a player, whether it's on a start-sit decision or the way you draft, the waiver wire pickup you make, the trade you make, how do you go back and figure out like why you missed the call? I know that every situation is going to be different, but what's that process like for you? Because I think a lot of times what not just we, I mean, we as like the Royal, like everybody, will say, well, the process was right. Like I had it there, but it wasn't the right result. So I'm going to keep going back and doing it the same. Like, what's the process like for you in figuring out what you got wrong?
I mean, I think it is looking at sort of the situation, sort of the game. Sometimes there is no real easy answer, right? I mean, I remember years ago, Sean Payton randomly giving Kobe Fleener like 3 goal line carries. And you're like, I don't know what to do with that, right? Like,
right.
It's like, hey man, he's got Mark Ingram here. Like, why wouldn't you give the ball to Mark Ingram a couple of times? But no, you're going to be tricky. Like, you can't really account for that. But I think when you're front facing, I do think just a sense of honesty about it goes a long way, right? Like, hey, I thought this is what was going to happen. Turns out that, the Eagles decided to defend differently that week. And so, Dak had to feature George Pickens more than maybe I thought he would. Something like that. I think it is about being open and honest about the fact that, hey, man, you made a mistake. Like, this was my process. Obviously, that didn't work out this week. it is, as Ian Hart always says, we're going to study the game film. We're going to try to get better next week. I mean, I think that's really part of it is just owning up to your mistake, saying, hey, look, this is why I thought it was going to happen. It obviously didn't happen. Let's kind of figure it out. And let's see if this is a thing that's sustainable, right? Like, hey, if all of a sudden Ricky Pearsall is getting all these targets in San Francisco, like, let's figure out why that is. And is this a 1 week thing? Is this based on how they were defending the Niners? Or is it that, like, Kyle Shanahan sees something here and now they really want to try to work that in? I mean, I think that's important, as owning that mistake, but understanding whether this is sustainable or it would just happen to be a one-off.
I love that. And because there is no kind of clear cut one size fits all answer for all of this. Like, it has to be on a case by case basis. If that's how we evaluate the things we want to get right, that's kind of how we have to evaluate the things that we do get wrong. Right? It's got to be case by case. I think the interesting thing is seeing, I mean, like, you've recently just experienced it, the future of fantasy football and like where it's going and the apps and the businesses and everything. This is absolutely a loaded question, but I kind of want to get your simple answer on it. It's just like, where do you see the game of fantasy football evolving to over the next few years? Because we've seen a lot of changes over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Like, going forward, what do you see from it?
I think at its core, I think it's not going to change dramatically, because I think for the majority of people, who just play in, say, your 10-team, 12-team office league, I think you'll see incremental changes, right? Like, those folks, they've moved from, standard scoring to PPR, to the point that PPR is kind of standard scoring now, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe they eventually move to, I don't know, maybe they eventually move to Superflex or 2QB, but I think that's a long time in the works. I think basically the basic game is going to stay the same for a really long time. But I do think we're going to see sort of more permutations. I think we're going to see more gamification of it for, I don't necessarily love that word, but I think that's kind of where it's going, right? So, like, for instance, like, best ball leagues have become a big deal. I think guillotine leagues are going to start to be, kind of a bigger thing, right? Because, one, it gives you, a thing you can play all year long, but also, like, hey, if you get knocked out of your guillotine league in, like, the first couple of weeks, you can always start another one. You can kind of keep going on that. It's just a fun, different way to sort of approach the game, because I think at some point we've done a pretty good job of solving for X and doing the different things of like, how to draft and that. So I think we have to sort of keep changing things around. I also think, whether you love it or not, for better or worse, I think the sports betting world and the fantasy world are going to continue to merge. I think that Venn diagram is going to start to overlap a little bit more. And so, things like, daily fantasy is sort of part of that, I think. But I think even within, whether you're placing bets on specific plays, or whether or not, like, how many fantasy points can Jamar Chase or Saquon Barkley or Bijan Robinson get in a quarter. I think there's going to be some sort of marriage of that. So, I think those things, though, will remain sort of, I don't want to say on the fringes, but it'll be people like us who have played for years, who've played a bunch of different formats and who are looking for something different. I think we will kind of push the limits of how the fantasy space and the fantasy game exists. But I really do think for the vast majority of people, it's always going to kind of be the same game, because I think for a lot more people, it's really more of a social experience than it is necessarily a competitive, trying to dominate your league and win a bunch of money experience.
100%, man. Like, that's honestly what it is. It's a social experience. It's the fun of doing your draft. It's the fun of the trash talking week after week, and then it's the fun of gloating that you won the championship to your friends for the rest of the year there. By the way, don't think I didn't notice. I heard you properly pronounce Bijan Robinson.
Bijan Robinson, man.
Well done.
His name
Kudos.
does not rhyme with a variety of mustard. All right, it does not rhyme with mustard. That's it. I was
talking to my co-host the other day, and he's like, well, then why would he do a Dijon mustard? And I'm like, well, maybe you've just been pronouncing the mustard wrong the whole time.
Why did Joe Theismann change his name from Joe Theismann? Because he was in a Heisman campaign at Notre Dame. Joe Theismann for the Heisman doesn't work.
It's the money, baby.
It doesn't work.
Make it work for you. That's it. That's it. Well, we referenced a community here and that social aspect of it. And one thing I love to do at the end of each show is to bring in questions from the audience, people that just want to know a little bit more about you. They're always non-player specific questions. So first one I have here is from a gentleman that you know, Jagger May,
Oh
who
yeah.
wants to ask, what has been your experience in growing a brand and doing something different outside of football, like 32-bit, for example? How's that experience been for you, and what advice would you give to someone building something?
It's been fun. It's been fun in part because it's just sort of nice to every now and then take a break from
Yeah.
football, right? And I mean, I know you guys are doing it with your your movies and your pop culture podcast and stuff like
Yeah.
that. I think in part just because we are all well-rounded people. That yes, what we do primarily is fantasy football, but we all have interests outside of that, and so I enjoy being able to kind of take a break from the other things. Also, though, for me, as much as I enjoy this, and I've been very fortunate to have a great career here. I don't think I want to do this forever. I don't think I want to do this for the rest of my life. And so I'd like to be able to somehow create a path or an avenue to blossom into something else, to pivot, right? And so, I would love to pivot into something that I enjoy. Like I the last couple of years have been fortunate enough to do a live stream in the mornings about Dodger baseball because I'm going to spend my evenings, in the summer and fall screaming about the Dodgers anyway. I might as well try to figure out how to make it a job at some point. So, I think it's always worthwhile because I also just think it helps you stretch your muscles in a lot of ways too. Because I think the people who are best at one thing, it's because they take from other things. I remember hearing Rick Rubin on a podcast, the great music producer, saying that the music that he enjoys most, the producers he enjoys most, they are taking from other styles, right? And so it's like, maybe you're a hip hop producer, but you listen to heavy metal, you listen to classical, you listen to electronic stuff, as opposed to the hip hop producer who only listens to hip hop. Eventually that kind of sounds the same. And so I feel like, even in your other works of life, if you're doing fantasy, why not do a pop culture or a movie podcast or something about other sports? Because I think you can sort of incorporate that and make your primary content seem a little bit deeper and more rich.
I have actually a follow-up question here from another person who has something similar, because you're talking about audiences and this, just engaging with people. And from Optimus Fantasy Football over here on Blue Sky, they ask, Marcus, how do you manage to engage your audience and maintain sanity in such a social media driven world? I mean, you just mentioned that you're doing all these different things, from Dodgers to 32-bit to NFL fantasy to fantasy life. Like there's just so many different things that you have done or are doing. How do you maintain sanity while still giving the people what they want?
I think honestly it's because I have tried to be sort of less online. I think over the last couple of years, especially in the off season, right? Like in the season, I think I'm very much online, partially because you're consuming news, you're keeping up with beat reporters, you're promoting your own work, you're promoting other people's work. So in season, I'm definitely a lot more online. But I think once football season ends, I try to unplug a little bit. I'm not always successful. Like I'll still open the app and I'll still scroll and stuff, but I'm not necessarily engaging a whole lot more. And I think that, that sort of helps keep me sane. I try to, as they say, go touch grass every once in a while.
Yeah.
But also I also think that my social media feeds, like I'm surprised people follow me, to be honest with you, because I go back and I look through some of my old posts and there's no real coherent thread to any of them. Like I'll
Not
just
me going through your Twitter right now, seeing
right?
what you're talking about.
I will kind of post whatever is sort of top of mind at the time. Maybe I'm watching something, maybe I'm just having like a random thought of something, and I'll post that just, kind of out of nowhere. So like I feel like people who follow me initially for fantasy football, I'm surprised that they don't just get fed up and unfollow, because like I'll go long stretches, especially in the offseason, without posting anything football related. So like, I think that sort of helps, at least helps my own sanity in the end. I don't know if I'm always necessarily serving the consumer, but it definitely helps, I think, keep me a little straight.
Well, I mean, honestly, man, like that should make you feel better, especially for saying like not everything there is coherent from the or connected from one thing to the next. I hope it's coherent. but like, I mean, like connected from one thing to the next, like that just means that people like you, like they enjoy you, man. You should take that as a huge compliment.
That's cool. Yeah.
Because like I genuinely, like, I enjoy your personality. I love your work. Like just spending this time with you has been great. And I gotta say, man, like I feel like I've learned a little bit more from doing this sit down with you. I know that our audience has as well. And man, I can't thank you enough for joining me here today, Marcus. I know it's the end of the show here. If you could please let everybody know what it is that you're working on and where they can find all your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of the places you can find my stuff, I'm not really so much on the X site anymore. I still have my account there at Marcus G, MarCasG, mostly over on Blue Sky. Same thing, Marcus G there. But the NFL Fantasy Football Podcast, we're 3 times a week. Wherever you find fine podcasts, you can also find ours. And then NFL Fantasy Live on NFL Network. We're on 5 days a week there. Also, in case, you're not sick of me, I'm on Sirius XM on Saturday mornings. Let me get these times right. I got to do it in my head Eastern. 10 to noon Eastern, right? It's 10 to noon Eastern, 7 to 10 a.m. Pacific on Saturday mornings. Me and a guy named Chris Manzo. It's not always fantasy. It's a lot of nonsense, but it's a lot of fun. And then, like I said, occasionally, every once in a while, in case you want to hear me moan about the Dodgers, which I think nobody really wants to hear me moan about a team that spent $1 billion on free agents and won the World Series. But in case you do, the ESPN LA YouTube channel, you can find it over there.
Nice, man. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining me here today. And as always, for everybody that is watching or listening all the way through, I can't thank you enough for being here with us. For myself, for Marcus, thank you. We'll see you next time. Adios.